The ancient Grecians were passionately fond of festivals and games. In every particular state, such institutions were occasionally celebrated for the amusement of the people, but these were far less interesting than the 4 public games frequented by multitudes from all the districts of Greece. The Pythian Games were celebrated at Delphi, the Isthmian of Corinth, the Nemean at Nemea in Argolis, and the Olympic at Olympia near Elis. We propose to give a brief account of the Olympic Games only, as being by far the most splendid, and in which victory was reputed to be the most honourable. The celebrity of these games was extended for many centuries after the extinction of Greek freedom, and their final abolition did not occur until after they had flourished for more than 1100 years. The games were held in summer when the heat was excessive, and to add to the difficulty and fatigue experienced, the more violent exercises were performed in the afternoon, when even the spectators were scarcely able to remain exposed to the sun. To prevent the competition of such as were unskilful, the candidates were required to swear that for 10 months before the commencement of the games they had made it their constant study to prepare for the contest, and during the last 30 days they were obliged to reside at Elis, and had to practice daily under the inspection of the judges. Hence, the permission to contend at the Olympia was regarded as no inconsiderable honour, and served in some degree as a consolation of the vanquished. Immediately before the commencement of the different exercises, a herald led every candidate separately through the assembly, and demanded if anyone knew him to be a man of profligate character, or to have been guilty of any notorious crime. As members were present from every state in Greece, to some of whom each of the combatants was known, it was rarely happened that any suspicious character chose to expose himself to such scrutiny. The candidates were required to make a solemn declaration that they would not endeavour to gain the victory by bribing their adversaries, or by a violation of the laws regulating the different contests, and any person guilty of a breach of this promise was not merely deprived of the olive crown, but was fined by the judges and could never attend at the games. These regulations seem to have accomplished the purpose for which they were intended, since, during several hundred years, only 5 instances occurred in which any improper artifice was known to be employed by the competitors in the games. Dacles the Mycenaean was the first who had the honour of being crowned with the simple wreath woven from the sacred olive tree near Olympia for his victory in the stadium. The Greeks held the exercise of wrestling in high estimation, which, in point of antiquity, stood next to the foot race. The object of the wrestler was to throw his adversary to the ground, but it was not till this had been thrice repeated that he obtained the victory. Like all who contended in the games, the wrestlers were accustomed to rub their bodies with oil, partly to check the excessive perspiration occasioned by the heat and the violence of the exercises, and partly from an opinion that oil gave the limbs a greater degree of pliancy and agility. As the smoothness occasioned by the oil would have prevented the combatants from grasping each other with firmness, it was customary for them, after being anointed, to roll themselves in the dust of the stadium, or to be sprinkled with a fine sand kept for that purpose at Olympia. If in failing, one of the wrestlers dragged his adversary along with him, the combat was continued on the ground, till one of the parties had forced the other to yield the victory. The inhabitants of Hindustan and the countries constituting the ancient kingdom of Syria had undergone a variety of revolutions, but inactivity has always formed the leading feature in their character. In every age they have fallen as easy prey to invaders, nor have the repeated instances of oppression to which they have been exposed ever roused them to limit the exorbitant power of their sovereigns. The Greeks, living in a climate nearly as sultry as that of Asia, would probably have fallen victim to the same indolence, had not their early legislators perceived the danger and employed the most judicious efforts to avert it. Among the means devised to accomplish this end, none seem to have been so effectual as the public games. It was not by any occasional effort that a victory could be gained at Olympia. Success could be attained only to those who were endured to hardship, who had been accustomed to practice the athletic exercises while exposed to the scorching heat of the sun, and who had abstained from every pleasure which had a tendency to debilitate the constitution and lessen the power of exertion. In Japan, wrestling appears to be an institution of greater importance than even in our own country. The meetings for its exhibition before the public are made quite important affairs. They are mapped out and arranged annually by the ruling authorities. A distinct race selected from the native population are brought up and trained in the practice from their youth. This tribe professed to trace back their wrestling long before the Greeks held their Olympic Games on the banks of the Alpheus. At the present day, it is asserted that the Mikado, or Emperor, near 700 years before Christ, encouraged wrestling, and during this long period, century after century, it has been one of the most popular amusements of this strange people. It might not have continued to flourish so long had not the government assisted in keeping the game alive by introducing it into and regulating the proceedings in all towns of any size. A large staff of professionals is kept solely for this purpose, and outsiders cannot enter and compete as is done in this country. The Japanese, from all we can glean, do not appear a race likely to be devoted to athletics, lighter amusements more suitable to their climate, requiring less violently body exertion, it may be inferred, would be more to their taste or inclination. Their mode of wrestling, however, has the advantage that it does not necessitate active preparation. Weight and bulk appear great, if not absolute, requisites in the wrestling ring. To accomplish these requirements, a fattening process is resorted to in lieu of hard work training. Ordinarily, the male Japanese are not more than 5 feet 5 or 6 inches in height. It is a remarkable fact, however, that in the wrestling class there are many 6 feet men weighing 14 stones and upwards, some few 18 or 20 stones. I have never anywhere, says Lindau, seen men so large and stout as these Japanese wrestlers. They are veritable giants. A concise description of one of their wrestling meetings may not be altogether without interest. A special department of the government is entrusted with the duty of carrying out arrangements for holding a series of meetings in all the principal towns. A programme is annually issued, so that any town set down for visitation has sufficient time to make all needful preparations. A large plot of ground for forming the ring is selected and enclosed with bamboos. Stages with seats are fitted up for the aristocracy and richer classes, and a small charge is made for admission. The ring is sure to be well filled, one half frequently being females gaily dressed for the occasion. The loud beating of a drum gives notice that proceedings are about to commence, and a dead silence reigns throughout the great crowd. An official comes forward and gives out with a loud voice the names of those about to contend, and announces, too, a list of places at which the fortunate ones have been successful. The drum again sounds, and all those appointed to wrestle enter and march around the ring, appearing as if duly impressed with the importance of the pending struggle. All are naked, with the exception of a gaudy silk girdle round the loins. After parading around the enclosure, the combatants divide themselves into 2 equal sides and squat down upon their heels. A stage is erected on 4 pillars in the middle of the ring and raised about half a yard. The manager calls out the names of the first pair to contend, one from each side, and at the same time announces his opinion how the betting should run. These preliminary proceedings conclude, the 2 called on step out and are greeted with cheers from all sides. They sprinkle the ring with rice and water before the more serious work begins, rub rice between their hands and drink salt and water. These curious proceedings take place in order, according to a prevalent superstitious notion, to bespeak the favours of God who rules gladiatorial contests in Japan. 4 umpires, grave-looking personages, are appointed and stationed, pipe in mouth, each pillar of the raged stage. A signal is given, and the 2 wrestlers, uttering loud defiant shouts and crowing like cocks, make a rush at one another, with all the fury and violence of 2 rival tups in the breeding season. The shock and noise of 2 such weighty bodies meeting resound all over the ring, and the spectators, after a momentary holding of their breath, give expression to their pent-up feeling by ringing shouts of admiration. Blood, in almost all cases, is seen to flow from both competitors as they separate with the rebound and slowly fall back. Again and again they meet, each endeavouring with his utmost power to drive his antagonist off the stage. After several rounds contested with this like violence and determination, they for a moment pause and resort to a trial of a different sort. They rush together and seize each other anywhere about the body or arms, incited and cheered on by the vociferous applause of the spectators. The fiercely contested struggle becomes intensely exciting as the athletes close and, locked together breast to breast and shoulder to shoulder, continue the conflict, each endeavouring to grasp the other around the waist. This is effected after pushing and wriggling about for some time by one or other of the wrestlers. After securing a firm grip, shaking his opponent, fixing his legs in position, and gathering himself up for a final superhuman effort, he lifts his now doomed foe high up in the air, and with what Cornishmen would call a forward heave, hurls him clean off the stage, where he lies for some time enduring a fire of bantering, and then walks quietly off. Breathless, blood-stained, and perspiring from every pore, the victor looks proudly about and is greeted with cheers renewed over and over again. After parading around the ring with uplifted, outstretched arms, he makes a respectful acknowledgement and walks off to his comrades. The manager again comes pompously forward and summons another pair. Fresh animated betting goes off while they prepare for the onset, and it may be this fondness for gambling common to most Eastern countries which helps to keep up the popularity of wrestling. The second couple go to work precisely as the first, then another and another, till, finally, the champion of the day is proclaimed and greeted with cheers that continue for some time. Generally, he is presented with a decorative belt, and, with it fastened around the waist, goes about the observed of all observers. And this, as detailed, is Japanese wrestling. We can hardly accord in the terms as understood amongst us, and cannot deem it entitled to be classed with the honoured back-hold pastime of Northern England, worthy of eulogy from the most fastidious-minded. Christopher North would not applaud a Yedo, meeting with the hearty praise he gives to the Cumberland and Westmoreland wrestling on the banks of the Windermere. Neither would Charles Dickens have gone away from the ferry so delighted, if the contest he witnessed had been such as the Japanese delighted in. Indeed, our readers generally will, we imagine, be apt to consider the Eastern wrestling amusement no better than something akin to our medieval barbarism. Certainly, nothing in athletics can be considered more strikingly different than one of our quick, scientifically harmless bouts, as distinguished from the butting or tupping, the pushing and hauling, the rough tumbling about and clumsy finale, in which victory is mainly due to overpowering strength and weight. There is a great similarity in the wrestling in India and the same pastime in Japan. This similitude is so close that after a description of the latter, there need not be much space devoted to narrative of the sport in our great Eastern Empire. The public exhibition of the sport is, in a great measure, confined to the soldiers of the native regiments of the infantry. Sometimes matches are made and come off which create widespread interest by men who do not belong to the service. So great is the interest taken in these contests that they often continue for the best part of a day, and during the whole time, couple after couple enter the ring and continue to exhibit their skills. There can be no doubt the encouragement of such pastimes will exercise a powerful influence in making them better soldiers and more attached to their service. The wrestlers are lithy active young fellows and enter the ring in exuberant spirits. Before the actual commencement of the struggle at close quarters, each resorts to a ridiculous ceremony in order to appropriate some powerful deity to whom they look for assistance to achieve success. The act consists in simply touching the forehead with a small portion of earth picked from the ground. On the conclusion of this preparatory proceeding, they return to the edge of the ring and go through a series of manoeuvres, which a stranger would look at with astonishment, and which in reality can exercise no influence on the struggle. They jump about, first on one leg, then the other, bounding backwards and forwards repeatedly with great agility. Loud bangs on the body follow, inflicted by the hands with such violence as to make a noise that resounds all over the ring. This is the opening play, followed by sham attacks, till an opportunity presents for close work. With surprising quickness, the arms are grasped high up towards the shoulders, and followed by violent quickness, and followed by violent butting of head against head, accompanied by twisting and wrenching. Meanwhile, one of the two is thrown to the ground, where the struggle is continued amid excited cheering, till one of the tawny-coloured competitors is forced on his back and securely held. This is seldom successful until 3 or 4 bouts have been fought out and a clear backfall gained. The following account of a great wrestling match between the Mysore hero and the Punjabi champion was written by an Englishman in Madras. The Punjabi champion is from North India. The Mysore man has lately won a great match and was highly elated in consequence, while the Punjabi had such confidence in his powers that he pledged himself to give up the Sikh religion and turn Mohammedan if he lost the match. After waiting a few minutes, the Punjabi was the first to put in appearance. He walked up amid scrutinising glances and stood within the ring. He was a great big fellow, beautifully built and splendidly developed, with muscles standing out in knots on his arms and legs. He was the same colour as most Punjabis, light brown. Taken on the whole, he was rather a handsome man. His opponent was not long in following him. He stood up, stripped, and stepped into the sand. He too was remarkably well built, but nearly black, and villainously ugly. He was not quite up to the Punjabi. His muscles were large, and he looked the more wiry and active of the two, but the Punjabi was the bigger and looked much stronger. They begin by standing 2 or 3 yards apart in an inclined position, stooping towards each other and advancing as stealthily as cats, suddenly making us snatch at each other's wrists and hands, and then drawing back with inconceivable rapidity. The neck was the great object of attack, and many attempts were made by the native of Mysore to get hold of his antagonist's neck, while the Punjabi made desperate efforts to clutch his adversary by the neck and force his head down into chancery. After a good deal of dodging and advances and retreats, clutches at neck, head and wrists, the Punjabi, who seemed the most eager of the two to finish the job at once, and had been acting more on the offensive than the defensive, suddenly made a rush in, tried to close and trip. Quick as he was, his antagonist was quicker, and the Punjabi hero was foiled. Then time was called, and a short interval allowed for breathing. Round number 2 began in right good earnest. Each man seemed thoroughly buckled to his work, and in a few seconds the Punjabi, who was in rare fettle, threw the Mysore man on his knees, but the latter, giving him a sudden and well-directed push, nearly caused him to change his religion. Both men recovered themselves with marvellous dexterity, and grasping each other they struggled up together. The Mysore champion getting upright a little the first, but almost immediately the Punjabi gave his man a clean throw forwards, and the native of Mysore was discovered lying full length on his chest, with the Punjabi kneeling on his back. From this time, the contest resembled nothing so much as a grovel behind goals for a touchdown. For a time, the struggles of both men were intense, the Punjabi having to do all he could to keep his man down at all, and it seemed quite possible that, if the Mysore native could get himself up, he would pull his opponent down, when the latter tried to roll him over. Presently came a pause, which the Punjabi used to his advantage, by covering his fallen foe with sand, so as to get the better grip. Skillful as the Mysore champion was, he could in no way relate when in this distressing position. However, he continued to make clever attempts to regain his feet, and still cleverer ones to pull down the Punjabi when he was endeavouring to turn him over. But, finally, the contest ended by the Mysore champion mistaking his chances to get to his feet, and after a grand struggle, up to the very last moment, the muscular Punjabi turned him flat over, so that there remained not the slightest doubt in the minds of all the spectators that both his shoulders were resting on the ground. The one throw was given, and the battle was won. The following account of a modern wrestling match in Turkey in the late 19th century is so graphically related that we feel confident it will be pursued with interest by most readers. We may remark, by the way, that the gypsies who figured in this match are of the same race as their namesakes in England and other parts of Europe, but they preserve in Turkey more of their oriental appearance and character. The writer is Lieutenant Colonel James Baker of the Auxiliary Forces, who published a book on Turkey in Europe in 1877. He said, "I passed through a fine town called Barakli Juma in the middle of a plain of Ceres, and inhabited principally by Christian Bulgarians. A great wrestling match was going on just outside of the town, and I stopped to witness the sport. A circle about 30 yards in diameter was formed by the men, women, and children, Turks, Bulgarians, and plentiful supply of gypsies, all sitting closely packed together around the circumference. There was the usual accompaniment of a gypsy band, composed of a drum and a clarinet, which was kept going continuously. A competitor stripped to the waist steps into the ring and walks around with a grand air as he displays his muscular frame to the admiring gaze of the bystanders. Presently his antagonist enters the ring, and both competitors shake hands in a good-natured way, and a little laughing and chaffing goes on. They then commence walking around, every now and then turning in to shake hands again, until suddenly one pounces upon the other to get the catch, and then the struggle commences. No kicking is allowed, and the throw must lay the vanquished man upon his back, so that both shoulder blades touch the ground at the same time. The champion was a burly Bulgarian of Herculean strength, when, at the invitation of some black-eyed gypsy girls, a fine but slim young fellow of their tribe entered the lists against him. But, although considering his youth, he made a gallant struggle. A quick throw laid him sprawling on his back, to the evident chagrin and disappointment of the gypsy women. Their eyes flashed with anger as they now held a hurried consultation, when off started a very pretty girl, evidently bound upon some errand. She soon returned with one of the most splendid specimens of humanity I ever saw. If, as it is asserted, there were princes and dukes amongst the ancient tribe of gypsies who emigrated to Europe, this must certainly have been a descendant of one of them. His fair escort pushed him into the ring with an air of pride and confidence, as much as to say, "Now you will see what a gypsy can do." The young man was about 25 years of age and nearly 6 foot high, with a handsome, aristocratic and cheery countenance, and as he took off his jacket and handed it to his fair one, and thus stood stripped to the waist, there was a buzz of admiration from the whole crowd. He was slightly made, but all was sinew. Laughingly and half modestly, he shook his powerful antagonist by the hand, and then the walking round commenced, the young gypsy talking and laughing all the time. It seemed as though neither liked to be the first to begin, when suddenly the Bulgarian turned a sharp upon his antagonist, and tried a favourite catch. But, quick as lightning, the lithe figure of the gypsy eluded the grasp, and a sigh of relief went up from his clan. The excitement was now intense, and the young girl perfectly quivered with nervous anxiety as she watched every movement of her swain. She would have made a splendid picture. They were still walking around, and it seemed as though the struggle would never begin, when, lo, a simultaneous cry went forth from the whole crowd, as the great Bulgarian lay sprawling and half stunned on the ground. The movements of the gypsy had been so quick that it was impossible to say how the throw was done, but the Bulgarian was turned almost a somersault in the air and came down with a heavy thud. The young champion shook him by the hand, lifted the heavy man high into the air, and then set him on his feet. The face of the young girl as she handed back her hero his jacket was pleasant to look upon. A lucky man indeed. As she took him by the hand and led him away to wherever he came from, I began to think there might be worse fate than being a gypsy. I was so attracted by the wrestling scene at Barakli Juma that I lost much time, and had to push on quickly in order that we might reach a khan, perched up in a small village amongst the mountains which lay between the Salamanika. Our acquaintance or familiarity with Old English wrestling is, as may be surmised, circumscribed. We have therefore endeavoured in part to introduce the Southern Ring in the introductory chapter. In carrying out this attempt, considerable and important assistance has been derived from having the benefit of referring to a rare and curious work by Sir Thomas Parkins, a distinguished wrestler and writer in the early part of the 18th century. According to Dr. Deering, in his History of Nottingham, a copy of Sir Thomas's work was forwarded to His Majesty George I with a manuscript dedication. Sir Thomas further intimates, "I invite all persons, however dignified or distinguished, to read my book. So say we, for a more thoroughgoing and candid book we did not know. A book containing many curious home thrusts and quaint sayings, bearing upon the art and mystery of wrestling. We can fully endorse the words of the Nottinghamshire baronet, when he says, "For my own part, I transcribe after no man, having practical experience for my guide in the whole art, and rely on observations made with the utmost accuracy." The art of wrestling in the present day is chiefly confined to the lower classes of the people. This is more especially the case in the south of Lancashire. In the north, yeomen's sons and farmers' sons are often exceedingly clever in the wrestling ring. The sport was, however, more highly esteemed by all classes of the ancients, and made considerable figure among the Olympic Games. In the age of chivalry too, to wrestle well was accounted one of the accomplishments which a hero ought to possess. The inhabitants of Cornwall and Devonshire, we are well assured, from time immemorial have been celebrated for their expertness in this pastime, and are universally said to be, in their style, the best wrestlers in the kingdom. To give a Cornish hug used to be a proverbial expression. The Cornish, says Fuller, are masters of the art of wrestling, so that, if the Olympic Games were now in fashion, they would come away with the victory. Their hug is a cunning close with their combatants. They learned the art at an early period of life. For you shall hardly find, says Carew in his survey of Cornwall in 1602, an assembly of boys in Devon and Cornwall where the most untowardly amongst them will not as readily give you a muster or a trial of this exercise as you are prone to require it. In olden times, says Stow in his survey of London, wrestling was more used than has been of later years. In the month of August, about the feast of St. Bartholomew, adds this very accurate historian, there were divers days spent in wrestling, the Lord Mayor, Aldermen, and Sheriffs being present in a large tent pitched for that purpose near Clerkenwell. But of late years the wrestling is only practised in the afternoon of St. Bartholomew's Day. The ceremony is thus described by a foreign writer, who was an eye-witness of the performance, when, he says, the mayor goes out of the precincts of the city and a sceptre, a sword, and a cap are borne before him, and he is followed by the principal aldermen in scarlet gowns with golden chains, and himself and they on horseback. Upon their arrival at this place appointed for that purpose, where a tent is pitched for their reception, the mob begins to wrestle before the two at this time. The following quaint and curious description of the row and destruction of property after the wrestling at the Hospital of Matilde, so different from our peaceably constructed northern rings, copied literally from Stow's Annals of England, will, we opine, be interesting to our readers. In the year 1222, Henry III's reign on St. James's Day, the citizens of London kept games of defence and wrestling near unto the Hospital of Matilde, where they got the mastery of the men of the suburbs. The bailiff of Westminster, devising to be revenged, proclaims a games to be at Westminster upon Lammas Day, whereunto the citizens of London repaired. When they had played a while, the baillie, with the men of the suburbesses, harnessed themselves and fell to fighting. That the citizens be fully wounded, were forced to run into the city, where they rang the common bell, and assembled the citizens in great numbers. And when the matter was declared, every man wished to revenge the fact. The mayor of the city, being a wise man and a quiet, willed them first to move the abbot of Westminster of that matter. If he would promise to see amends made, it was sufficient, but a certain citizen named Constantine Fitzarnulf willed that all house of the abbot and bailiff should not be poured done, which words being once spoken, the common people issued out of the city without any order, and fought a civil battle, and pulled down many houses. On March 31st, 1654, the Puritan Parliament passed an ordinance prohibiting cock matches, i.e. cockfighting, and likewise issued excommunications against well nigh all manner of sports and pastimes. Nevertheless, we find that Cromwell relaxed the strung bow by times, and indulged himself in witnessing some hurling and wrestling matches in Hyde Park. As the following quotation from the Commonwealth newspaper, the Modern Intelligencer, amply testifies. Hyde Park, May the 1st, in 1654. This day there was a hurling of a great ball by 50 Cornish gentlemen on one side, and 50 on the other. One party played in red caps and the other in white. There was present His Highness the Lord Protector, many of his privy council, and divers eminent gentlemen, to whose view was presented great agility of body, and most neat and exquisite wrestling at every meeting of one with the other, which was ordered with such dexterity that it was to show more the strength, vigour, and nimbleness of their bodies, than to endanger their persons. The ball they played with was silver, and designed for the party that won the gold. The same newspaper continues, This day was more observed by people going a-maying than for diverse years past, and indeed much sin committed by wicked meetings with fiddlers, drunkenness, ribaldry, and the like. Great resort came to Hyde Park, many hundreds of rich coaches, and gallants in rich attire, but most shameful powdered-haired men, and painted and spotted women. Some men played with a silver ball, and some took other recreation. Later on, John Evelyn's diary furnishes us with a view of wrestling for fabulous terms. We think £100, given at a meeting in the present day, a large and tempting amount. The following, however, taken into consideration the value of the money, upward of 200 years ago, does seem astounding. 1669, the 19th of February, I saw a comedy acted at court. In the afternoon, I saw a wrestling match for £1,000 in St. James's Park, before His Majesty, a world of lords and other spectators, twixt the western and northern men, Mr. Secretary Morris and Lowe Gerald being the judges. The western men won, many great sums were betted. After the foregoing brief notice of ancient wrestling, we shall proceed to crave the reader's attention to a similar pastime after the style practised in the counties of Devon and Cornwall. In doing so, we are fortunately enabled to gather important information from a rare and interesting old book by Sir Thomas Parkins, previously referred to, and first published in the year 1713. This work was held in such high estimation that in 1727 a third edition had to be printed, and as the circulation would, in a great measure, be confined to the southern parts of the kingdom, such a rapid and numerous sale must be taken to indicate extraordinary popularity. It will be gathered the manner of wrestling differs materially from the scientific, manly, back-hold Cumbrian method. The space, however, devoted to the Cornish hug, even in a work professionally devoted to northern sports, will, it is confidently presumed, prove acceptable, particularly to readers who admire the art of wrestling, which Nottinghamshire Baronet designated as the most useful and diverting to mankind, and diverting healthfully studies. Such are the means by which he avers you will restore posterity to the vigour, activity, and health of their ancestors, and the setting up of one of Palasteria in every town. Thus were our Britons in the days of old by sports made hardy, and by actions bold. And were they now injured to exercise, and all their strugglings were for virtue's prize? Man against man would not for power contend, no lust of wealth would hug a private end, nor each would wrestle to suppliant his friend. W.T. an in-play of the Cornish hug. Not content with this glowing eulogium on a sport long dear to the Cumberland and Westmoreland, and as emphatic as any ever uttered on the Swifts of Carlisle, the enthusiastic baronet goes on to say, no doubt but wrestling, which does not only employ and exercise the hands, feet, and all other parts of the human frame, may well be silted both an art and a science. However, I will do my endeavour, both hip and thigh, that wrestling shall no more be looked upon by the diligent as a mystery. Sir Thomas finds, wrestling was one of the 5 Olympic games, and that they oiled their bodies, not only to make the joints more supple and pliable, but their antagonist might be less capable to take fast hold of them. I advise that all my scholars never to exercise upon a full stomach, but to take light liquids of easy digestion, to support nature and maintain strength only. Whilst at Westminster, I could not learn anything, and when I went back to Cambridge, I then, as a spectator, only observed the vast differences between the Norfolk outplayers and the Cornish huggers, and that the later could throw the others when they pleased. The use and application of the mathematics here in wrestling I owe to Dr. Barthurst, my tutor, and Sir Isaac Newton, mathematic professor, both of Trinity College in Cambridge. He goes on to say, I advise you to be no smatterer, but a thorough-paced wrestler, perfect and quick, in breaking and taking all holds. Otherwise, where you'd break a hold, if you don't proceed sharply to give your adversary a fall, according to the several following paragraphs, you're not better than one engaged at sharps, who only parries his adversary, but does not pursue him with a binding and home thrust. The following warnings are especially worthy of a wrestler's attention. Whoever would be a complete wrestler must avoid being overtaken in drink, which very much enervates, or being in a passion at the sight of his adversary, or having received a fall, in such cases is bereaved or his senses, not being master of himself. is less of his art, but showeth too much play, or none at all, or rather pulleth, kicketh, and ventureth beyond all reason and his judgment when himself. He goes on to remark that sticking to these observations will enable a good wrestler to stand champion longer for the county, as appears by my friend Richard Allen of Hucknall, alias Green from his grandfather who educated him, who has wore the bays and frequently won most prizes, beside other by-matches, reigned champion of Nottinghamshire and the neighbouring counties for 20 years at least, and about 8 months before this was printed. He wrestles for a small prize, where at least 12 couples were competitors, and without much fatigue won it. Whoever understands wrestling will never call the outplay a safe and secure play. Besides, the in-play will sooner secure a man's person when playing at sharps than the out, which ought to encourage gentlemen to learn to wrestle. In this learning to wrestle, our ingenious author turned trainer would admit no hereditary gouts or scrofulous tumours, yet I'll readily accept of scorbutnic rebutism, because the person labouring under those maladies are generally strong and able to undergo the exercise of wrestling. I am so curious in my admission, I'll not hear of a hipped out of joint. For I, Marshall, I receive no limberhams, no darling-sucking bottles, who must not rise at midsummer till 11 of the clock, and that the fire has aired his room and clothes. The baronet's beau ideal of a wrestler's bodily formation is just such as we like to see in a northern ring. He must be of middle size, athletic, full-breasted and broad-shouldered, for wind and strength, brawny-legged and armed, yet clear-limbed. The following rules and regulations, some of them especially, are worthy the consideration of those who are managers in our northern rings at this present time. 1. The 2 gamesters that wrestle together shall be fairly chosen by lot or scrutiny, according to the usual practice. 2. The said 2 gamesters shall wrestle till one of them thrown 3 falls, and he that is thrown first for 3 falls shall go out, and not be allowed to wrestle again for this prize. And it is hereby ordered and agreed that he who comes first with the joint at once of the ground, as joints are commonly reckoned in wrestling, shall be reputed to throw in the fall. 3. No gamester shall hire another to yield to him upon any condition whatsoever, and if any such practice to be discovered, neither of them shall be capable of the prize. 4. But he that stands the longest and is not thrown out by anyone shall have the prize, provided he does not forfeit his right by breach of these rules. If he do, the gamester that stands the longest and observes these rules shall have it. 5. If any differences shall happen concerning the wrestling, they shall be determined by 2 men, which shall be chosen by the most voices of the gamesters, before they begin to wrestle, and in case they can't decide such differences, then they shall be referred to solely to the decision of the Sir Thomas Parkins as umpire. 6. He that wins the prize and sells it shall be incapable of wrestling here any more. 7. That none shall have the prize that wrestle with shoes that have not any sort of nails of iron or brass in them. 8. He also that winneth the prize 1 year shall be excluded from wrestling for it the year following, but the next year after that, viz., the third including the first, he may put in and wrestle for the prize again, and ever after that, unless he shall win a second prize, and from that time ever after excluded. Sir Thomas Parkins, of Bunny Park, Nottinghamshire, the author of this ingenious and singular work before us, from which we have quoted largely, upon the Cornish hug or the in-play wrestling, was a man who did not content himself with a mere theoretical knowledge of the art, which he professed mathematically to teach. There was scarcely a sinewy and dangerous problem in his treatise, which he had not worked with his own limbs upon the Nottinghamshire peasantry of 1705, when he was young, lusty, and learned, and could throw a tenant, combat a paradox, quote Marshall, or sign Mittimus, with any man of his own age or country. He was, it will be allowed, a skilful wrestler, a subtle disputant, and a fair scholar, with certain egocentricities which he could afford to indulge in. He passed a very reputable life, doing all the good he could to the peasantry of his neighbourhood, both in body and mind, at once showing how to be strong and enabling them to be happy. Sir Thomas Parkins was born about the year 1678, whether at his paternal seat in Bunny Park, Nottinghamshire, or in London, we're unable to collect. Probably in London, as we find him early at Westminster School, wrestling his way through the classics under the celebrated Dr. Bushby. The epigrams of martials appear first to have led him to turn serious thoughts towards wrestling, and he does not relish the poet that he himself practised this healthy art after his daily prayer and family business. From Westminster, Sir Thomas, after a due course of little to do and bushby, went to Trinity College, Cambridge, and studied mathematics, as we gather, afterwards for the chief purpose of making himself an accomplished scientific wrestler. At the then celebrated place of learning, students, he says, even at the universities, give the exercise of wrestling and lie under a pecuniary moule for not appearing in the summer evenings appointed for that exercise. Happy and long was the life which Sir Thomas led at Bunny Park, a bold pleasantry its country pride. By his advice, an example grew up gallantly around him. He gave prizes of smart value, but large honour, to be wrestled for on sweet midsummer eves upon the green levels of Nottinghamshire, and he never felt so gratified with the scene as when he saw one of his manly tenantry and the evening sun go down together. He himself was no idle patron of these amusements, no delicate and timid superintendent of popular sports, as our modern wealthy men for the most part are, for he was never objected to take the most sinewy man by the loins and try to fall for the gold-laced hat he himself contributed. His servants were all upright, muscular, fine young fellows, civil but sinewy, respectful at their proper hours, but yet capable also at the proper hour of wrestling with Sir Thomas for the mastery, and never so happy or so well approved as when one of them saw his master's two brawny legs going handsomely over his head. Sir Thomas prided himself, indeed, having his coachman and footman lusty young fellows that had brought good characters for sobriety from their last places, and had laid him down on his spine. Lord Thomas Manners, who learnt the art of broadsword exercise from St. Thomas Parkins, thus addressed his master on May 21st, 1721. Happy is for us that we have in this effeminate, weak age of powdered essence bottles and curled coxcombs a person of rough manners and a robust constitution, one that can stand upon his own legs, and droves of those modern waxen. Things that have fallen before him, one that instructs Englishmen to deserve the title, and teaches them to make their broadswords the terror of all of Europe. Men like you lived when Greece knew her happier days. It was a spirit like yours that instituted and supported the Olympic Games, but when their luxurious neighbours once taught them to sleep till 12 of the day, to pin up their locks in papers, to come from the boxes of their chariots into the insides of them, to use almond paste and rose water, in short, to quit roast beef and hasty puddings, for soups and rag-outs, the empire of the world was taken from them and translated to the tough sinewy Romans, and when they ceased to merit their epithets, their eagles drooped her wings, and the brawny Britons were the favoured of Mars. A fitting conclusion to the preceding notice of the much-esteemed Bunny Park Baronet will become to be bestowing a passing notice on the monumental memorial erected to his memory in Broadmoor Church, Nottinghamshire. The ruling passion is made apparent even after death had given Sir Thomas the last hug. On one side of the monument he is represented in wrestling attitude, on another he appears thrown aback by time. The following is a free translation of the Latin inscription that lies on the statue. Here lies, O Time, the victim of thy hand, the noblest wrestler on the British strand. His nervous arm each blood opposer quelled, in feats of strength by none thee excelled, till springing up at the last trumpet's call, he conquers thee, who will have conquered all. In the year 1827, a society styled the St. Ronan's Border Club was established at Innerleithen near Peebles, the object of which was to revive the old martial spirit of the borders, to encourage the practice of outdoor sports and pastimes, and to yield amusement to the visitors of this sequestered watering place. Lockhart, in his Life of Sir Walter Scott, after giving an account of the publication of the novel of St. Ronan's Well in 1823, thus proceeds to describe the establishment of the annual gathering at Innerleithen. Among other consequences of the revived fame of the place, a yearly festival was instituted for the celebration of the St. Ronan's Border Games. A club of bowmen of the border, arrayed in doublets of Lincoln green, with broad blue bonnets, and having the Ettrick Shepherd for captain, assumed the principal management of this exhibition, and Sir Walter was well pleased to be enrolled among them, and during several years was a regular attendant, both on the meadow, where, besides archery, leaping, racing, wrestling, stone heaving, and hammer throwing went on opposite to the noble old castle of Tranquois, and at the subsequent banquet, where Hogg, in full costume, always presided as master of the ceremonies. A gayer spectacle than that of the St. Ronan's Games in those days could not well have been desired. The shepherd, even when on the verge of 80, exerted himself lustily in the field, and seldom failed to carry off some of the prizes, to the astonishment of his vanquished juniors. And the bon vivants of Edinburgh mustered strong amongst the gentry and yeomanry of Tweedale to see him afterwards in his glory, filling the president's chair with eminent success, and commonly supported on this, which was in fact the grandest evening of this year, by Sir Walter Scott, Professor Wilson, Sir Adam Ferguson, and Peter Robinson. The Earl of Tranquois was patron of the club, and amongst the members not mentioned by Lockhart occur the names of the Duke of Buccleuch, Lord Napier, Robert Gladstone of Liverpool, William Blackwood, James Ballantyne, and Adam Wilson, captain of the 6 Feet Club. At a later date, Glassford Bell, Sheriff of Lancashire, took great interest in these sports as well. Professor Wilson was anxious to get enrolled in the 6 Feet Club, but could not manage it. He was just half an inch too short. The games continued to be celebrated yearly in the early autumn, and lasted 2 days, and the second day being mostly devoted to archery. Amongst the various athletes who entered the list, the following are probably the most noteworthy. Professor Wilson, or Christopher North, threw the hammer. James Hogg tried his hand at the bow and the rifle, but yet, in despite of Lockhart's praise, the shepherd did more doughty deeds with the grey goose quill than with either of those weapons. Robert Bell from Jedwater was the champion putter of the stone, and could have been matched against any man in the 3 kingdoms in throwing the 16 or 21-pound ball, he upon his knees and his opponent on his feet. An advertisement appeared in a leading newspaper to back him for £100 against all comers, the challenge to hold good for 12 months, but there was no one to take it up. The Harper brothers, farmers near Innerleithen, held several prizes for throwing the hammer, and Leyden of Denholm, the champion leaper, could spring 32 feet at 3 standing leaps. The first competition was held at Innerleithen on the 26th of September 1827, and amongst other prizes competed for, the 6 Feet Club of Edinburgh gave a silver medal to the best wrestler in the backhold style, as practised in Cumberland and Westmoreland. The introduction of this mode of wrestling into Scotland may probably be attributed to the great interest which Professor Wilson took in the formation of the games. The prize in 1827 was gained by George Scougal, a native of Innerleithen. On one side of the medal was the following inscription: presented by the 6 Feet Club to the St. Ronan's Border Club, to be awarded to the best wrestler at their first gymnastics competition at Innerleithen on the 26th of September 1827. And on the reverse side of the medal, the following quotation from Waller: Great Julius on the mountain bred, a flock perchance of herd had led. He who subdued the world had been, but the best wrestler on the green. Gained by George Scougal from Innerleithen, 32 competitors. Scougal carried off also the head prize for wrestling at the St. Ronan's Games for the years 1828 and 1829. After performing these feats, he was outlawed, that is, he was excluded from contending again in the same arena for the 3 years which followed. When past the prime of his life, he was induced to enter the wrestling ring again, which he very unwillingly did, after much persuasion, and once more succeeded in bearing off his first honours. In his day, Scougal was looked upon as the champion wrestler of the Scottish side of the borders. At the St. Ronan's Games, he gained 6 medals for wrestling and throwing the hammer, and likewise a considerable number of trophies at other local meetings. A stout, massive-built man, he stood 5 feet 11 inches high and weighed from 15 to 16 stones. With little or no knowledge of scientific wrestling, he nevertheless proved more than a match for all comers, by the Herculean amount of power he possessed in his shoulders and arms. His unusual mode of attack was to gather an opponent well to his breast, and then by sheer strength keep him there until a favourable opportunity presented itself to rush in upon him. When excited or ruffled in temper, he gripped his man quickly and firmly, and then, in spite of all struggles and clicks, threw him over his hip. These movements were the nearest approach to science known to Scougal. Scougal was a butcher by trade, and is thus referred to as Noctus Ambrosiana in the shepherd's parlance. Georgie Scoogle slaughtered a beast last market day at Innerleithen, and his meat eye prime. On one occasion, he actually felled a bullock with a blow from his fist, and in the smithy, which adjoined his slaughterhouse, he not unfrequently exhibited feats of surpassing strength, one of which was to lift a wagon axle and 2 wheels, with a heavy man seated at each end of the axle. His skill in throwing the hammer was well known too, and during his early manhood, he carried off most of the leading prizes. At several meetings, the Harpers came into competition with him, but never approached any nearer with the second to dual border champion of wrestling and throwing the hammer. Old people who remember Scoogle's earliest efforts describe him as a veritable Goliath of Gath in strength, but unless unduly excited, as gentle as a woman in manner and bearing. After Scoogle's 3 years had elapsed, Robert Mickey of Harwich came to the fore as an amateur wrestler. Mickey took the belt at St Ronan's and kept it about him 2 years. He was present at the most of the gymnastic gatherings on the borders and carried off many prizes for wrestling and hammer throwing. At the Harwich Border Games in 1831, he threw Thomas Emerson from the neighbourhood of Carlisle. After an excited contest of some duration, his hammer throwing at St Ronan's was inimitable, and has been described by the Ettrick shepherd as the bridle of Polmood. Emerson was a powerful built man, a mason by trade, who wrestled for several years in the Carlisle and the other rings, with moderate successes. He won the head prize at Harwich in 1835. Mickey is introduced anachronically into the royal bridle in Wilson's Tale of the Borders, after the following fashion. At a distance from the pavilion was a crowd composed of some 700 or 800 peasantry engaged in and witnessing the athletic games of the Borders. Among the competitors was one called Michael Robin, or Robin Michael. He was strength personified. His stature exceeded 6 feet. His shoulders were broad, his chest round, his limbs well and strongly put together. He was a man of prodigious bone and sinews. At throwing the hammer, at putting the stone, no man could stand before him. He distanced all who came against him, and, while he did so, he seemed to put forth not half his strength, while his skill appeared equal to the power of his arm. The following notice of the wrestling at St Ronan's for 1831 is copied from the Edinburgh Literary Journal. Wrestling is not a Scotch game, as will be conceded by everyone who has been present at the Carlisle and St Ronan's games. There is strength enough amongst our peasantry, but it is the ore. It has never been moulded for a practical purpose. Men came forward on this occasion who never would have dreamt of thrusting their noses into an English ring, and they set to work in a slovenly, unhandsome way, some of them armed with a hat, coat and shoes. Still, amid the motley crew you might recognise men who know how to seize and to wield their antagonists, and we trust next meeting will witness a better turnout. There were other local athletes who figured in the ring of St Ronan's, almost a match for Scoogle. George Best of Yarrow possessed far more science than the Innerleithen butcher, and was the holder of several prizes. Best, likewise, finds a niece in the Noctes Ambrosiana of October 1828, where the shepherd is made to exclaim, "Tibby's married, the tailor carried her off, the flying tailor of Ettrick, him that can do 15 yards at hap step a loup, back and forward on level grun, stood second a year in the ring of Carlisle, can put a stain with a foot of Edinburgh Bell himself, and fling the hammer nis best over the border of Geordie Scoogle of Innerleithen." In which year of grace, we wonder, did Best stand second in the Carlisle ring? Wilson's memory must have proved treacherous when he remembered this sentence. At all events, if Best did wrestle second a year in the ring at Carlisle, it must have been for some minor prize long since forgotten. Abraham's clerk of Cowsey, farmer, a man of powerful frame, entered the ring after Scoogle was outlawed and did some noteworthy feats. Another man, also remembered as a prize taker in the ring at St Ronan's, was Walter Scott of Selkirk Carrier. At Miles End in Northumberland, athletic games were kept up until recently. Young men from both sides of the borders entered keenly into these contests, and one noteworthy peculiarity of them was that of keeping up the old national traditions and characteristics of Englishmen being pitted against Scotsmen, and Scotchmen against English. This mode of contesting was the means of producing many splendid feats of agility and prowess, but was apt to degenerate into mere exhibitions of warm blood, which too frequently ended in blows being exchanged by the rival combatants. Remnants of these contests may be witnessed to this day at the annual fair of Shagshaw Bank, between the shepherds from the Reed, Liddell, Coquet and Tyne, and those from the Slitrig, Jed, Oxmoor, Cale and Teviot. Wrestling was always a leading sport at these gatherings. Single stick, tilting, leaping and foot racing were also practiced, and hence the devotion shown to these and similar activities in these pastimes by the sturdy race of people living on both sides of the Cheviots.